On August 16, 1977, the world received the news that Elvis Presley had died at the age of 42. Within hours, media outlets across the United States confirmed what many fans refused to believe. He had been found unresponsive inside his home, Graceland, in Memphis. Emergency responders were called immediately, and he was transported to the hospital, where doctors later pronounced him dead. While the public reacted with shock and grief, authorities began their standard procedures, because despite his fame, this was still a sudden death that required documentation and review. Law enforcement officers and medical personnel needed to understand exactly what had happened inside the house that morning. And as they began examining the situation, they encountered details that would later become central to understanding Elvis's final days. When officials entered Graceland, they were not walking into a chaotic scene. The house was quiet, organized, and showed no signs of forced entry or external disturbance. There was no indication of violence, nothing suggested a struggle. From a law enforcement perspective, this immediately ruled out several possibilities. Instead, attention shifted toward Elvis's physical condition and daily routine. Investigators began observing the environment, the layout of the rooms, the items around him, and the general structure of how he had been living. Because in cases like this, the surroundings often tell part of the story. One of the key observations made during the investigation was Elvis's lifestyle pattern. By 1977, he was known to have an irregular sleep schedule. He often stayed awake during the night and slept during the day. This pattern was confirmed by people close to him, including those who had been at Graceland in the days leading up to his death. Investigators took note of this because sleep disruption can have significant effects on physical health. It also helped explain why many of the events surrounding his final hours occurred during early morning hours. Another important element documented at the scene was the presence of prescription medications. It is well established through official reports that Elvis Presley had been prescribed multiple medications from different doctors. These medications were intended to treat various health conditions, including sleep issues and other medical concerns. However, when authorities reviewed the situation, the quantity and variety of prescriptions became a point of attention. Not because a single medication was unusual, but because of how many were being used at the same time. As part of the process, investigators also relied on testimonies from people who had been around Elvis in his final days. Accounts from those close to him described a man who appeared physically tired and less energetic than before. There were no reports of sudden panic or extreme events. Instead, what emerged was a pattern of gradual decline. This detail is important because it suggests that his death was not caused by a single, unexpected incident. Rather, it was likely the result of ongoing health issues combined with long-term physical strain. And that realization would guide everything that came next in the investigation. One of the most critical areas examined during the investigation was the bathroom where Elvis Presley had been found. According to official accounts, he was discovered unresponsive in that room by his fiancée, Ginger Alden. When authorities reviewed the scene, there were no signs of external trauma or forced interference. This reinforced the idea that the cause was internal rather than the result of any external action. From a law enforcement perspective, this significantly narrowed the scope of the investigation. As the focus shifted toward medical causes, Elvis's known health conditions became increasingly relevant. By 1977, he had a documented history of issues including high blood pressure and gastrointestinal problems. These conditions were being treated with prescription medications, which had been part of his routine for years. However, managing multiple conditions often requires careful coordination, something that was not always consistent at the time. This raised questions about how his treatments were being handled. Toxicology reports later confirmed the presence of multiple prescription drugs in Elvis Presley's system. This finding was not unusual on its own, given his medical history. But what stood out was the combination of substances and how they may have interacted with each other. At the time, it was not uncommon for different doctors to prescribe medications independently, without centralized oversight. In Elvis's case, this may have created a situation where the cumulative effects became dangerous. Despite these findings, the official cause of death was not immediately framed in dramatic terms. Authorities concluded that Elvis Presley had died from heart-related issues. However, it was also acknowledged that his overall health condition and medication use were contributing factors. This distinction is important because it shows that his death was not the result of a single cause, but rather a combination of conditions that developed over time. As more details became public, the story began to shift from shock to analysis. Fans and media outlets started asking deeper questions. How had someone so closely monitored by doctors reached this point? Could anything have been done differently? And were there warning signs that had been overlooked? These questions would not only shape public discussion, they would also keep the story alive for decades. As the investigation progressed, more attention was given to the people who had been closest to Elvis Presley in his final days. Law enforcement and medical reviewers relied on testimonies from those inside Graceland to better understand his condition. Several individuals described noticeable changes in Elvis's behavior and physical state. He appeared more fatigued, less engaged in conversations, and often disconnected from what was happening around him. These observations were consistent across multiple accounts, which gave them greater credibility. At the same time, none of these testimonies pointed to a sudden or alarming event. There were no reports of panic, no urgent warnings, and no clear indication that something critical was about to happen. This lack of a defining moment made the situation more complex. It suggested that Elvis's condition had been deteriorating gradually rather than collapsing suddenly. For investigators, this reinforced the idea that his death was the result of a long-term process rather than a single isolated incident. Another key aspect that emerged was the structure of Elvis Presley's medical care. Unlike modern systems where treatment is often centralized and coordinated, Elvis had access to multiple physicians. Each doctor addressed specific symptoms or conditions, prescribing medications accordingly. While each prescription may have been justified individually, the combined effect became increasingly difficult to manage. Over time, this created a layered system of treatment where multiple substances were being introduced into his body without full coordination between providers. Investigators and medical professionals reviewing the case later pointed out that this lack of oversight may have contributed significantly to the outcome. It wasn't a question of one mistake, but rather a system that allowed risk to build over time. Public reaction to these revelations was immediate and intense. Fans who had initially been in shock began searching for answers, trying to understand how such a loss could happen. Media coverage expanded beyond the announcement of his death, diving into details about his health, his lifestyle, and the circumstances surrounding his final days. For many, the image of Elvis Presley began to shift. He was no longer seen only as the king of rock and roll, but also as a man dealing with real and complex struggles. This shift did not diminish his legacy, but it added depth to it. It revealed a human side that had largely been hidden behind fame.